The day Myrtle Ford buried her husband, she made herself a promise standing there in the red Oklahoma dirt with the wind cutting through her black dress like a blade. She would not ask a single man for a single thing, not ever again, because she had learned early and painfully that asking invited owing, and owing invited loss. That was the spring of 1881, and Thomas Ford had been dead 3 days before anyone thought to come out and tell her they were sorry. The neighbors said it was a shame. A woman alone with 240 head of cattle, a leaking barn, and 700 acres of Oklahoma Territory grassland that didn't care one bit about her grief. They said she ought to sell. They said she ought to move to town. They said she ought to write to her sister in Missouri. They said a lot of things, and Myrtle listened to every word with her jaw set and her dark eyes dry, because she had already cried herself out the night Thomas died, alone on the kitchen floor with her face pressed against the cold boards, and she wasn't going to do that in front of anyone. What she did instead was roll up her sleeves. Literally. She stood in her kitchen the morning after the funeral and rolled her dress sleeves past her elbows, went out to the barn, and started doing the work that had to be done. Thomas had been sick the last 4 months of his life, which meant the cattle had been half-managed at best. The south fence line had 3 gaps she knew about, and probably more she didn't, and the water trough near the upper pasture had cracked clear through in the January freeze and still hadn't been replaced. She replaced it herself. She found the gaps in the fence and mended them herself, learning from necessity and from the memory of watching Thomas work, and from a battered manual she found in his desk about cattle husbandry that she read by lamplight every night until the pages softened with use. She hired 2 hands that first summer, men from town who worked respectably and kept their distance, and she paid them fairly in cash, never in credit, because she didn't want anyone to have a claim on what she was building. What she was building was survival, plain and simple, and over 4 years it became something more. By the spring of 1885, Myrtle Ford's cattle operation was one of the better ones in Pawnee County. She had grown her herd to 380 head, built a new barn with her own earnings, dug a second well, and established a reputation among the buyers at Stillwater that her cattle were always healthy, always the right weight, and always delivered on time. She was 31 years old. She had a face weathered just enough by sun and wind to look capable, rather than worn, dark auburn hair she kept braided tight during working hours, and green eyes that could measure a man or a storm cloud with the same steady calm. She had also developed a reputation for not needing help. That reputation was not entirely accurate, but it was close enough that most people honored it, and Myrtle had come to count on it the way she counted on the fence posts she had driven herself into the hard red earth. They held things in the place she needed them to be. What she had never quite calculated was what would happen if someone came along who didn't know about the reputation, and who happened to ask her something instead of waiting to be asked. Martin Walden arrived in Pawnee County on a Tuesday in early April 1885, which was an ordinary day in every respect except for the fact that it was not ordinary at all. He came on horseback, a dark bay gelding with good legs and an easy gait, and he had with him only a canvas saddlebag and a bedroll, and a letter of introduction to a rancher named George Haverston, who had recently purchased land adjacent to the north edge of Myrtle's property. Martin was 34 years old, born in Kansas, and had spent the last 12 years working cattle in Texas, New Mexico, and the Indian Territory before that. He had a tall frame and broad shoulders and hands that showed every year of that work, and he had a way of being quiet that was not the same as being empty. It was the quiet of a man who had learned to think before he spoke and found that thinking generally improved the outcome. He was also, as he would have been the first to admit, not very good at small talk, which was why he tended to ask direct questions when he wanted to know something, because questions cut through the unnecessary parts and got you where you needed to go. He met Myrtle Ford for the first time at the Stillwater Feed Exchange on a Wednesday morning, the day after he arrived, when he had ridden into town with George Haverston to learn the lay of the land and the lay of the commerce. George was the kind of man who introduced everyone to everyone, because he believed business grew out of acquaintance. And so when he spotted Myrtle Ford at the counter discussing a bulk order of supplemental feed, he walked Martin right over and said, "Myrtle, this here is Martin Walden. He's going to be working my North Range. Martin, this is Myrtle Ford. She runs the Ford Ranch east of my property line, and she knows more about cattle than most men I've ever met." George meant it as a compliment. Myrtle received it with a polite nod and a look that suggested she had heard that particular compliment 100 times and had long since stopped caring whether it was meant as one or not. "Mr. Walden," she said, and extended her hand in the businesslike way she had cultivated over 4 years of being the only woman in rooms full of men who were trying to decide whether to take her seriously. Martin shook it without hesitation, without the slight pause men sometimes had when they weren't sure whether to shake a woman's hand or just nod at her, and he said, "Mrs. Ford, George tells me you've been running your spread alone for some years." "I have," she said. "That's considerable work," he said, not pity, not surprise, just acknowledgement delivered flat and sincere. She looked at him a second longer than she usually looked at people she'd just met. "It is," she agreed. Then she finished her business at the counter, said good day to George, said good day to Martin Walden with the same measured courtesy she gave everyone, and walked out to her wagon with her receipt folded in her coat pocket. Martin watched her go. Not in the way some men watched her, with that combination of appreciation and condescension that she had learned to recognize and dismiss. He watched her the way he might watch something he was trying to understand carefully without assuming he already knew the answer. "She's something," George said beside him. "She is," Martin agreed and left it at that. He didn't see her again for 2 weeks, because April was a busy month for both of them, and because he had 300 acres of new range to assess and a herd of Haverston's cattle to acquaint himself with, and Myrtle had her own calving season to manage, which had come in heavier than the previous year and kept her moving from dawn to full dark every day. Calving season was the part of ranching that Myrtle never quite got used to not having an extra pair of hands for. During the 4 years she had managed alone, she had learned to handle difficult births herself, had learned which signs told her a cow needed help and which told her to wait, had talked more than one calf through its first hours with a patience that surprised even her. But there were nights when the ground was cold and the air was sharp, and she had been awake 20 hours already, and the physical work of it pushed against the edges of what one person could reliably do without a mistake. She didn't make a mistake that April, but it was closer on 2 occasions than she liked to admit. The second of those occasions was on a Saturday night when a heifer she'd been watching all day finally went into a labor that went wrong in the particular way that meant the calf was positioned sideways, and Myrtle was already in the barn with her sleeves rolled and her jaw set, doing what had to be done, when she heard a horse come into her yard. She was not in a position to go find out who it was. She was in the barn, on her knees in the straw, doing the slow, careful work of repositioning a calf in the dark while the heifer labored, and the lantern swung in the wind from the open barn door. And she was focused entirely on that, because if she lost focus, she lost the calf and possibly the cow, and she was not going to do that. Martin Walden, who had been riding back from town along the road that ran past the south edge of her property, and had seen a light burning in the barn at an hour when barns generally weren't lit, pulled up at her gate, because he was a man who had been around cattle long enough to know that late-night barn lights during calving season sometimes meant trouble. He tied his horse and walked to the barn door and saw Myrtle Ford on her knees in the straw with both arms deep in a situation that was clearly in progress. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he hung his hat on the barn door post, rolled up his own sleeves and walked over. "Tell me what you need," he said. She looked up at him. Her hair had come half out of its braid and there was straw in it. Her face was tight with concentration and effort. For one moment she was about to say that she didn't need anything, that she was fine, that it was under control, and all of those things were partly true, but they were not the whole truth, and she was tired enough and honest enough that the whole truth won. "I need someone to keep her still," she said. "She's moving when I need her steady." He moved to the cow's head without a word, talking to the animal in a low, even voice that Myrtle found herself listening to even while she was working, because it was a good voice, not loud, not soft, just present and calm, the kind of voice that animals and people both tended to believe in. The calf came 20 minutes later, slick and dark and breathing, and the heifer put her head down and then up again, and the barn smelled of new life in that particular way that Myrtle had come to understand as one of the few things that made the hard parts worth the hard parts. She sat back on her heels and let out a breath that she'd been holding in pieces for the last hour. Martin was still at the cow's head, his hand on her neck, watching the calf find its legs with the expression of a man who had seen this 1,000 times and still found it worth watching. "Thank you," Myrtle said. He looked at her. "You'd have managed." "Eventually," she said, "but this was faster." She got up and went to the water bucket in the corner and washed her hands and arms, and he did the same when she stepped back, and neither of them spoke for a moment because there was something in the air of that barn that was warm and simple and didn't need words put around it. "I should have introduced myself properly before I walked into your barn," he said. "You introduced yourself last week in town," she said. "Martin Walden, working Haverston's North Range." "That's right." "And you saw the light and stopped." "Old habit," he said. "Late light in a calving barn." She studied him. She had spent 4 years developing a precise and accurate ability to assess what a man actually was versus what he wanted to appear to be, because the survival of her ranch had depended on that accuracy more than once in negotiations, in hiring, in the quiet political business of being a woman who owned valuable land in a territory full of men who thought valuable land should belong to someone else. Martin Walden, as best she could read him, was exactly what he appeared to be. That was unusual enough that it made her slightly more careful rather than less. "You want to come up to the house for coffee," she said. It was not quite a question. It was the only hospitality she could offer that felt proportionate to what he had just done, and she was a woman who paid her debts. "I wouldn't say no," he said. So they walked up to the house through the cool April dark, and Myrtle built up the fire in the kitchen stove and set the coffee on, and Martin Walden sat at her kitchen table and looked around the room with the same interested, non-assuming attention he seemed to direct at everything, and she thought that if he made one remark about the lack of a man's touch in the house she would ask him to leave. He didn't. What he said was, "That's a good stove. You keep it in good order." "It's 7 years old," she said. "Came with the house when Thomas and I bought the place." "Thomas was your husband." "He was. He's been gone 4 years this March." "I'm sorry," Martin said, and he said it simply, without the weight of obligation that people usually put on condolences when they didn't know someone well enough to really feel them but felt they ought to say something. "Thank you," she said in the same simple way and poured the coffee. They talked for an hour. Not about personal things, not at first. They talked about cattle, about the Oklahoma Territory, about the drought conditions that had been worrying the whole county for 2 years, and whether this season's rain looked better or not. Martin had opinions and he offered them plainly and listened when she disagreed, which she did twice, and both times he considered what she said and once changed his position and once held his ground and explained why, and she respected both responses equally. When he stood to leave, he picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the chair beside him and said, "Mrs. Ford, I have a question for you." She had been carrying the cups to the dry sink. She set them down and turned. "Go ahead." "Would you be opposed to a neighbor," he said, "not a helper, a neighbor. Someone who happens to ride the same roads and shares information about weather and range conditions and doesn't make anything else of it." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and smoke from the stove, and outside the wind was moving through the spring grass in the way it did at night in April, which was one of the sounds Myrtle had learned to love about this place because it was constant, and because it belonged to her. "I've had neighbors for 4 years," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking if you'd be opposed to this one specifically." There was something so careful and honest in the way he said it that she felt it land differently than she expected, not as an imposition, not as an offer of help she hadn't asked for and didn't want, as an actual question to which she was being given the actual choice of yes or no. "No," she said, "I wouldn't be opposed." He nodded, put his hat on, and said good night, and she listened to his horse leave her yard and stood in her warm kitchen for a while after that, not quite sure what to make of Martin Walden, but fairly certain she was going to find out. The neighbor arrangement turned out to be exactly what he said it was. Over the next 3 weeks, Martin rode past her south fence line when he was working Haverston's range, and sometimes stopped at the fence to exchange information. And twice, he came to the house in the early evening at a proper hour and sat at her kitchen table and had coffee and talked. He told her things she found useful. There was a grass rust moving through the northwestern ranges that she should watch for. The buyer from Kansas City who was coming through in June was known to lowball first offers but settle fair if you held firm. The spring he'd found on Haverston's range appeared to be fed by the same underground flow that had been feeding her upper well, which was good news for both of them. She told him things she found useful to tell, where the road to Stillwater was passable, and where it had a soft spot from the winter runoff, which of the county officials were worth cultivating and which were not, the going rate for Oklahoma cattle among the 4 main buyers she'd worked with, and how each of them liked to conduct business. They were useful to each other in the neutral, professional way that neighbors can be, and Myrtle would have been entirely comfortable with that arrangement indefinitely if something else hadn't happened in May. What happened in May was a storm, not just a rainstorm. A storm of the kind that the Oklahoma Territory produced with an enthusiasm that could feel personal. 3 days of hard wind and driving rain that washed out the ford crossing on the creek between her east pasture and her main range, and left 60 head of cattle stranded on the far side with no practical way to get them back without either swimming them through a flooding creek or driving them 3 miles north to the Haverston crossing, which was on land that wasn't hers to use without permission. She rode to the Haverston ranch on the 3rd morning of the storm in the rain because she needed to use that crossing, and she was going to ask properly rather than assume, because she had built everything she had on the principle of doing things the right way. George Haverston was a reasonable man and said yes immediately, and Martin, who was in the barn when she rode in, heard the exchange and met her at the door. "I'll help you drive them," he said. "I can manage a drive on my own," she said. She was dripping water on the barn floor and she was cold, and she was not in the mood to perform gratitude. 60 head in a storm is easier with 2, he said. It was a statement of practical fact, not an offer of charity, and he delivered it in that same level way he delivered most things. She looked at him. He was already reaching for his rain slicker. "Fine," she said. The drive took 4 hours through wind and rain and mud, and it was hard physical work, the kind of work that left no room for conversation or for thinking about anything except the animals and the terrain and the weather. Myrtle worked the south flank and Martin worked the north, and they communicated across the distance with the hand signals that cattlemen in the territory had developed over decades. And once when a dozen head broke toward the creek, she cut them off before he even had to move. When they got the cattle through the Haverston crossing and across the 3 miles of road and into her east pasture, the rain had lightened to a thin mist and both of them were thoroughly wet and thoroughly tired, and Martin's dark bay was caked with mud to his belly. "Come in," she said. "You need dry and you need food." "I won't argue that," he said. She made a hot meal of beans and cornbread and cured pork because it was what she had ready and what could be made fast. And Martin ate at her kitchen table with the direct appreciation of a man who had spent a lot of years eating trail food and knew the difference. He had taken off his wet coat and his wet hat and hung them by the stove, and she had changed into dry clothes and put her wet braid up while he was seeing to the horses, and they sat across from each other at the table and ate and talked, and it was easy in the way things are easy when they've already been through something hard together. "You lost any fence posts in the lower section?" he asked. "Two that I saw, maybe more." "I'll check tomorrow. I've got extra posts at the Haverston barn. George won't miss them. I'll bring them over." "I'll pay for them," she said immediately. He looked at her, not with frustration, with something more like patience. "I know you will," he said. "That wasn't the point." She held his gaze. "What was the point?" "The point was that I know where the posts are and you need posts," he said. "That's the whole point. That's all it is." She looked down at her plate and then back up at him. "I've had men offer things that turned out to have a good deal more attached to them than the thing itself." "I imagine you have," he said. "I'm not those men." "I don't know that yet," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't. That's fair." There was something about the way he said that, without defensiveness, without the hurt pride that men usually displayed when their offers of help were questioned, that disarmed her in a way she hadn't been disarmed in 4 years. She had built a wall around herself that was solid and reasonable and hers, and she didn't particularly want it dismantled, but she was beginning to understand that Martin Walden wasn't trying to dismantle it. He was just standing near it, in that patient, quiet way of his, not trying to climb over and not trying to knock it down, just being there. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. "Bring the posts," she said. "I'll pay the going rate." "Fine," he said, and finished his cornbread, and when he left that evening she stood on her porch and watched him ride away through the clearing weather and felt something she couldn't quite name but recognized as the beginning of something she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she was ready for. June came in hot and dry, the way summer came to Oklahoma territory. And with it came the Kansas City buyer Martin had warned her about, a man named Calvert who arrived in Stillwater with a slick suit and slicker manners, and immediately made Myrtle an offer for 30 head that was 15% below what she knew the cattle were worth. She held firm. Calvert came back twice with numbers that were better but still not right, and on the third visit she told him plainly what price she would accept and that her schedule did not allow for further negotiation, and Calvert, recognizing that she was serious, accepted. She told Martin about it the next time she saw him, and he laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, full and genuine, and she realized she hadn't heard him laugh before. She found that she liked it more than she had expected to. "George got low-balled by the same man," Martin said. "I told him to hold out. He didn't." "George is too eager to be liked," Myrtle said. "Most people are," Martin said. "You're not." She considered that. "I used to be," she said. "Then I decided it cost too much." He looked at her with that careful attention. "What changed your mind?" She thought about how much to say and then decided that he had asked directly and that was how she preferred to communicate. "When Thomas got sick, we needed help. Real help, financial help. I asked Thomas's brother for a loan. He gave it, but he attached conditions to it that I didn't know about until Thomas was gone and the brother came to collect what he considered his due, which was more than money." She paused. "I paid him back every cent and told him not to come on my property again. But I learned that asking creates obligation and obligation can be used in ways you didn't agree to." Martin was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard lesson." "It's an honest one," she said. "It is," he agreed. "But not every debt works that way." "How do you mean?" He looked out at her pasture, where the cattle were moving slowly through the summer heat in the way cattle move when they're content and have enough water and grass. "Some people give things because they want to give them, not because they expect to collect later. Those exist too." "I know," she said. "I just haven't always been able to tell the difference in time." "That's why it pays to go slow," he said. She looked at him. "Is that what we're doing?" He met her eyes. "I think that's what I'm doing," he said. "I thought I should let you know that." Myrtle had spent 4 years not being surprised by people, and she found that Martin Walden surprised her regularly in ways that were not alarming but were notable. She went home that evening and sat on her porch until the stars came out, thick and brilliant the way they were in the Oklahoma Territory sky, and she thought about what slow meant in the context of a man like Martin Walden, and whether she was ready to find out. The 4th of July brought most of Pawnee County into Stillwater for a celebration, a parade, a band, various competitions and food, and the general cheerful chaos of a territorial town in summer. Myrtle went every year because it was good business to be seen, and because she had 2 hands who deserved a day off, and because she privately enjoyed the pie competition, which she had no interest in entering but a great deal of interest in judging. She had not expected Martin Walden to be standing at the edge of the square when she arrived, holding 2 glasses of lemonade and looking like he had been there long enough to have known she was coming, which he had, because he had asked George Haverston's wife, who was the kind of woman who knew everyone's schedules. "I figured you for a lemonade person," he said, and handed her one. She took it. It was a warm day and the lemonade was cold, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "You asked Mrs. Haverston where I'd be," she said. "I did," he said. "No apology, no denial, just confirmation. And brought me lemonade." "And brought you lemonade," he agreed. She drank it. "Thank you," she said. They walked through the celebration together, and it was the first time they had been in a public place together, and Myrtle was aware of the interest this generated. Pawnee County was not a large community, and Myrtle Ford was a woman people watched, and Martin Walden was a new face, and people put things together quickly. She could feel the attention like a slight pressure, not unpleasant but present, and she noticed that Martin neither ignored it nor performed for it. He just walked beside her and talked about whatever they happened to be passing, and when old Judge Pemberton stopped them to ask Myrtle how her cattle count was looking for the season, Martin stood quietly at her shoulder and let her conduct that conversation entirely on her own terms, which he might not have realized was one of the things she appreciated most about him. There was a band playing in the square, fiddle and guitar, and a fellow with a harmonica who was somewhat better than average. And in the evening, when the heat had dropped to something tolerable, and the fireflies were coming out in the grass along the edges of the square, people danced. Myrtle had not danced since Thomas was alive. She had stood at the edge of dances for 4 years and watched other people and felt nothing particular about it because she had trained herself not to feel particular things when they weren't useful. Martin offered his hand to her with the same directness he offered everything, no flourish to it, just his hand, palm up, waiting. She looked at it. She looked at him. She put her hand in his. He was a plain dancer, capable and steady, not showy, which matched everything else about him, and his hand was warm and firm at her waist, and she was aware of the particular warmth of being close to another person in a way she had not been aware of that in a long time. They didn't speak during the first dance. The music was too good and the night was too warm, and there was too much being said in the simple fact of it. When the song ended, she said, "You planned this." "Some of it," he said. "The lemonade, and knowing where you'd be. That was presumptuous," she said, but she said it without heat. "Was it wrong?" he asked. She looked up at him in the warm dark with the fiddle starting again and the fireflies cutting slow arcs across the summer air. "No," she said, "it wasn't wrong." They danced 2 more songs and then got pie because Myrtle had been thinking about the pie competition for 2 hours and wasn't going to skip it on account of dancing. And they ate their pie on the bench outside the livery stable and talked about nothing important, which was a thing Myrtle realized she had been missing without knowing she'd been missing it, talking about nothing important with someone whose company she wanted for its own sake. "I want to tell you something," Martin said, when they had been quiet a while. "Tell me," she said. "I've been in this county 2 months," he said, "and I know you'd say that's not enough time to know much about a person, and you'd be right. But I know enough to say that I'd like more time, if you're open to it." Myrtle set her plate down carefully on the bench beside her. The night sounds of Stillwater went on around them, music from the square, distant laughter, horses. She thought about what it meant to be open to something and how long she had kept herself closed and why and whether the reasons were still as good as they had been 4 years ago. "I'm open to time," she said. "More than that I can't promise right now." "More than that I'm not asking for right now," he said. She nodded, and they sat on the bench a while longer in the warm July night, and it was the kind of easy silence that felt like its own answer. August was hot and golden and relentless, and Myrtle worked through it the way she worked through everything steadily, methodically, without complaint, because complaint didn't change the temperature and the work didn't do itself. Martin came to her property twice a week now, sometimes more, and it had ceased to be remarkable within the county. People had stopped watching it with speculation and started treating it as an established fact, which in the way of small communities had the effect of making it feel more real rather than less. What was changing between them was slower and more complicated than anything that had a straightforward name. They argued sometimes about cattle, about territory politics, about the right way to handle a particular fence line dispute Myrtle was having with a neighbor to her west, and the arguments were good ones, the kind where both people thought harder because the other person pushed back. Martin never talked over her. He never dismissed her conclusions without hearing them fully. He never did the thing that men had done to her since she was young, which was to listen with the appearance of attention while actually waiting for their turn to say what they'd already decided. He also, in August, met her hands, Billy Reeves and Court Stubbs, who had worked for her for 3 and 2 years respectively, and who were decent men, young and reliable, with the particular loyalty that develops between people who have worked hard together in difficult circumstances. Both of them regarded Martin with the careful watchfulness of men who considered Myrtle Ford their employer, and therefore felt some proprietary interest in her interests. Martin shook both their hands, talked to each of them about their work with genuine interest, and by the end of the first week had established a kind of easy professional respect with both that Myrtle found she was glad of. "He's all right," Billy said to her one morning, with the understatement of a young man who had already made up his mind but wasn't going to say so directly. "He is," Myrtle said, and left it at that. What she was less willing to leave alone was the question of what she actually felt, because she had spent 4 years being practical about everything, and feelings were not practical, and she didn't know quite what to do with them now that they had arrived without asking permission. What she felt was warm when he was near. What she felt was sharper-minded when they talked. What she felt when he was not around was an awareness of his absence that was different from the awareness of anyone else's absence, and that distinction was the kind that could not be argued away with practicality. She was also aware, in the honest and sometimes uncomfortable way she was aware of most things, that she was frightened. Not of Martin. She had assessed him thoroughly enough by now to be fairly certain he was not a man who would deliberately hurt her. She was frightened of the wanting itself, because the last time she had wanted something this much and built her life around it, she had ended up on a kitchen floor at midnight with her face against the boards. Loss was a particular shape of pain that she recognized and did not want to invite back. She told him this on an evening in late August when they were sitting on her porch watching the last color go out of the sky, which was a thing they had started doing without quite deciding to, because the sunsets in Oklahoma Territory in summer were extravagant and it seemed wrong to miss them. "I'm afraid," she said. "I want you to know that." He turned to look at her. "Of me?" "Of this," she said. "Of wanting something I could lose." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand that. I don't want to say I don't feel it too, because that wouldn't be honest. I've had losses. Not the same as yours, but I know what it costs." "What kind of losses?" she asked. He looked at the darkening sky. "My wife," he said, 8 years ago, fever. We'd been married 14 months. Myrtle had not known this. She looked at him and felt the weight of it, a weight she recognized. "I'm sorry," she said, the way he had said it to her, simply, without obligation. "She was a good woman," he said. "Her name was Clara." "I spent a long time after that moving around, working cattle in places I had no connection to, because connection costs something I wasn't willing to spend. He paused. Until I came here and met you and found I was willing again. The sky was dark now, and the first stars were appearing, and the air had cooled to something gentle. And Myrtle sat beside this man, who had lost the same thing she had lost, and come through it to the same strange, tentative place she was standing in. And she reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat there until the stars were fully out, not saying anything more, and it was enough. September brought the fall cattle drive, which was the centerpiece of Myrtle's year, the drive from her property to the rail loading yards at Stillwater, where the Kansas City buyers took their percentage of Oklahoma cattle, and the ranchers got their annual return. Myrtle ran it herself, as she always did, with Billy and Court and 2 additional hands she hired seasonal, and the drive took 4 days and was demanding and dusty and satisfying in the clean way of work done right. Martin rode with her on the second day, at her invitation, because George Haverston's cattle were also in that drive as part of a cooperation arrangement between neighboring ranches that Myrtle had established 2 years earlier, and that saved both operations time and money. They rode side by side along the east flank of the herd in the long golden afternoon light of September, and Myrtle thought she had probably had good days in her life, but she would be hard-pressed to name one better than this one. At the yards in Stillwater, the sale went well better than the previous year, with prices up across the board and her cattle in the kind of condition that drew serious bidders. She concluded her business with the satisfaction of a woman who had prepared carefully and been rewarded for it, and she found Martin at the edge of the yards when she was done, his own paperwork completed, leaning against the fence with his hat tipped back watching her finish. "Good numbers," he said. "Very good," she said. She could feel the satisfaction of it in her chest like a physical warmth. "You should be proud," he said. "I am," she said, and she was, deeply and unapologetically, because she had earned it. They rode back together in the failing afternoon light, just the 2 of them and the open road, and it was the kind of easy companionship that Myrtle had not let herself hope for because hoping for things had seemed dangerous. She was beginning to revise that position. In October the weather turned as it did, and the territory settled into the hard, brilliant clarity of fall, with cold nights and warm afternoons and the grass going tawny gold across the hills. Martin came for supper one evening in early October and stayed late, later than he usually did, and when he stood to go he stood at the door for a moment and looked at her in the lamplight with an expression that was serious and considering. "Myrtle," he said, "I need to ask you something." She was standing across the kitchen from him. "All right," she said. "I want to court you," he said. "Proper. Not this, whatever this has been, which I've valued greatly, but something with intention behind it. Something that goes somewhere." Her heart was doing something complicated. "You're asking my permission to court me." "I am." She crossed her arms, not defensively but thoughtfully, the way she crossed them when she was thinking through a problem. "Most men would have just started without asking," she said. "I'm not most men," he said. It was not arrogance, it was simple fact. "No," she agreed, "you're not." "I know what I want," he said. "I wanted to make sure you know it too before we go further, because I don't think you'd appreciate finding that out partway through." He was right about that. She did not appreciate things revealed partway through. She appreciated everything on the table from the start. "What do you want?" she said. "Say it plainly." "I want to marry you," he said. "Not tomorrow. Not before you're ready. But that's where I'm pointed. I want you to know that so you know what you're agreeing to if you say yes." Myrtle stood in her warm kitchen in the lamplight and looked at Martin Walden, who had come into her life 2 months ago and asked her something instead of offering something, and she thought about what it meant that he was doing the same thing now, asking plainly, without pressure, giving her the same real choice he had given her at the beginning. "Yes," she said, "you can court me." He smiled. It was a good smile, honest and warm, and she thought she could probably look at it for a long time without growing tired of it. "Thank you," he said. "I'll see you Thursday." He put on his hat and went out into the October night, and Myrtle stayed where she was in the middle of her kitchen and felt the peculiar combination of terrified and glad that she suspected was what hope felt like when you'd been without it for a while. The courtship was Martin all the way through its steady, deliberate present. He came twice a week to supper, sometimes 3 times, and they talked about everything and nothing, and he helped with things that needed helping with and never made it feel like charity. He brought her a book from the Stillwater General Store, a novel she'd mentioned wanting, and left it on her porch without ceremony because he'd remembered she mentioned it, and he was in town, and that was reason enough. He met her in town on Saturdays sometimes, and they walked the square together in the way of people who have an understanding, and Myrtle found that she liked being seen beside him in a way she hadn't expected to like, because she had spent 4 years being conspicuously solitary, and she had not known until now that the solitude had carried its own kind of weight. In November, 2 things happened. The first was that the neighbor to Myrtle's west, a man named Prentice who had been arguing a property line for 2 years, escalated his argument by pulling down a section of her fence and bringing his cattle onto her land. Myrtle handled this with the full legal weight of her property records and a trip to the county sheriff, and the matter was resolved in her favor within a week because her records were impeccable, and she had kept every survey document Thomas had ever filed and added every one she'd commissioned herself. Prentice was told firmly and officially to rebuild her fence and keep his cattle on his own land. Martin had offered to go with her to the sheriff's office. Said no, she could handle it. He nodded and said he knew she could and let her go. When she came back with the matter resolved, he said, "Well done," and she said, "Thank you," and they both understood the exchange perfectly. The second thing that happened in November was that Martin told her he had been offered the foreman position at the Haverston Ranch on a permanent basis, which meant he was staying in Pawnee County, which meant the question of what he wanted was not abstract. "You're going to stay," she said. "I'm going to stay," he confirmed. "I wanted you to know before it was settled in case it changed anything for you." She looked at him. "Why would it change anything?" "Because it makes this more real," he said. "I'm not a man passing through anymore." "You stopped being that in April," she said. "Somewhere around the time you walked into my barn at midnight without being asked." He looked at her. "Does that bother you that I didn't ask?" "No," she said, "because what you did in there was you saw a need and you addressed it. You didn't impose yourself. You asked what I needed and then did that. That's different." "Most things are different in the specifics," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "They are." He took the Haverston foreman position. By December, he was spending so much time at her property that it was becoming practically logistical. Not improper. There was nothing improper about any of it, and people in the county had long since categorized them as a matter of course, but practically logistical, because he would ride over in the morning and help with the stock and stay through supper, and ride back to Haverston's in the dark and do it again. And both of them were fully aware that this was an inefficient arrangement. Christmas came to Pawnee County in the form of a church service and a shared meal with several neighboring families, and Martin came with her to both, and she sat beside him in the pew and felt the ordinary, extraordinary fact of having someone beside her in the specific way of someone who was there on purpose. On the ride home through the cold December night, the stars were extraordinary and the road was hard with frost and their breath made small clouds in the air, and Martin rode beside her quietly and then said, "Myrtle." "Yes," she said. "I don't want to wait," he said. "I'll wait as long as you need, but I want you to know that I'm not waiting because I'm uncertain. I'm certain. I've been certain for a while now." She rode for a moment. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'll marry me," he said. "When you're ready, could be tomorrow, could be spring. I just want to know if the answer is yes." The night was very still and very cold and very clear. Myrtle thought about 4 years of driving her own fence posts into the hard red earth and managing her own cattle and paying her own debts and proving to everyone, including herself, that she needed nothing and no one. She thought about how true that had been and how it had saved her and how it was also, she now understood, only part of a truth, the part that kept you standing, not the part that made standing worth something. She thought about Martin Walden walking into her barn in April without being asked, and asking her what she needed, and then doing exactly that and nothing more or less. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes." He stopped his horse and she stopped hers, and he looked at her in the starlight with that expression that was warm and serious in the particular way of things that matter. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she agreed. "Let me get through calving season and then yes." He laughed and she laughed, and their laughter went up into the cold, clear Oklahoma night like something being released, and it was a good sound, and neither of them stopped smiling the rest of the way home. They told people on New Year's Day, which was the first gathering of the county that followed their agreement, and the response was warm and unsurprised and genuinely pleased, because people who had watched Myrtle Ford for 4 years run her ranch with solitary determination had also watched her over the past 9 months begin to open, and Martin Walden was regarded with the approval reserved for men who had earned rather than assumed their place in a community. George Haverston shook Martin's hand heartily and told him he was a lucky man. George's wife embraced Myrtle and said she was so glad, and Myrtle let herself be embraced and found she didn't mind it the way she would have a year ago. Billy Reeves grinned and said he'd seen this coming since June, and Court Stubbs said something similar, and Myrtle told them both they were insufferable, which was the closest she came to expressing how touched she was. January and February passed in the particular way of Oklahoma Territory winters, cold and clear and occasionally dramatic, with a blizzard in the middle of February that kept everyone indoors for 4 days, and resulted in Martin simply staying at the Ford Ranch for those 4 days, because riding back to Haverston's in a blizzard was unreasonable, and there was nothing improper about a man taking shelter from a blizzard. He slept in the barn, which he insisted on despite the guest room, because he was not going to give the county gossips an easy story, and Myrtle respected that. The 4 days of the blizzard were some of the best 4 days she could remember. They played cards. They argued about books. He helped her mend harness while she told him the full history of her fence dispute with Prentice, and he told her the full history of his years working cattle in Texas and New Mexico, stories that were funny and sometimes hard and always interesting. They cooked together in her kitchen, which revealed that Martin had the basics of cooking and she had more than the basics, and by the 4th day they had a comfortable, easy domestic rhythm that felt both new and entirely natural. When the blizzard broke and he saddled the dark bay to go back to Haverston's, he stopped at the barn door and looked at her. 4 days wasn't enough, he said. No, she agreed. It wasn't. He rode out into the brilliant post-blizzard morning, and she watched him go from the porch and thought about spring. Calving season in March of 1886 was heavy again, though slightly better organized than any previous year, because Martin helped her plan for it in advance, not taking it over, not telling her what to do, but sitting at the kitchen table in January with her calving records and her herd book, and thinking through it together the way 2 people who share a problem can approach it with twice the perspective. The result was that they staggered the expected calving dates more deliberately and established a watch rotation between her, Billy, and Court that meant no one person was up for more than 6 hours at a stretch. Martin came over every day during calving season, after his own work at Haverston's was done, and the nights when he arrived at her barn and found her already in the middle of something, he rolled up his sleeves and asked what she needed, the same as the very first night, and she had long since stopped having any instinct to refuse. The last difficult calving came on the 20th of March, which was the anniversary of Thomas Ford's death, a fact that Myrtle noted in the way she noted it every year, quietly, privately, with a brief acknowledgement before the day continued. Martin knew the date and he said nothing about it directly, but he worked beside her that day with a gentleness that was different from his usual matter-of-fact thoroughness. And when they had the calf safely on its feet and the cow settled, he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and she covered it with hers, and that was sufficient. The wedding was set for the third Saturday of April, exactly 1 year from the night Martin had walked into her barn and asked what she needed. Myrtle had not thought much about weddings in the years since Thomas died. Her first wedding had been simple, a church in Kansas where she'd grown up, a small gathering of family. This one would be simple too, but it would be hers in the way things are yours when you've built them yourself from a place of certainty. She made a dress from blue wool because she was a practical woman and blue wool would be useful after the wedding. And she was not going to wear white because she was 32 years old and a widow, and white was not her truth. The blue was a deep, warm color that suited her auburn hair and her sun-weathered face, and the fact that she was exactly who she was and not pretending otherwise. Martin wore a clean dark coat and his best hat and his good boots, and he looked like himself, which was exactly right. The ceremony was at the small church in Stillwater, performed by the Reverend who had known Myrtle for 4 years, and who did the ceremony with both dignity and genuine warmth. George Haverston stood up with Martin. Billy Reeves, who had cleaned himself up considerably for the occasion, stood on Myrtle's side, and the church held maybe 30 people, most of them neighbors and people she'd done business with over 4 years. And the April sun came through the windows at exactly the right angle to make the whole room warm and golden. Martin took her hand when the Reverend asked and held it the way he held things, firmly, without excess, meaning it completely. When the Reverend asked if Myrtle Ford took Martin Walden as her husband, she said yes in a voice that was clear and level and entirely sure. The reception was at her ranch, because it was a big enough space and it was hers and that mattered, and George Haverston's wife organized the food and several of the neighboring women brought dishes, and there was music, a fiddle player and a man with a guitar, and people ate and talked and danced in the barn that Myrtle had built with her own earnings. Martin danced with her again as he had at the 4th of July celebration 10 months before, and this time he held her closer and she let him, because the distance between them now was a choice rather than a boundary. "1 year ago you asked what you could ask me," she said, while they were dancing. "I asked if you'd be opposed to a neighbor," he said. "That was the beginning of it," she said. "I knew that when I asked it," he said. "I didn't want to start somewhere I hadn't been invited." She looked up at him. "You asked me something instead of offering something. That was the thing." "Is that what you needed?" he said. "That's exactly what I needed," she said. "Someone who understood the difference." He held her a little tighter and she let herself be held, and the fiddle played on, and the barn was warm and full of light, and the spring night outside smelled of grass and rain-cleaned air. And Myrtle Ford, Myrtle Walden now, though she intended to keep both names for business purposes because she had built a reputation under the one and she wasn't going to set it aside, danced in her own barn with the man she had not expected and had chosen anyway. The summer of 1886 was the best working season she'd had in 5 years, and part of that was the rain, which came properly that year after 2 dry ones, and part of it was the improvements they made together. A new section of fence along the south pasture, a second water trough in the lower field, a repair to the barn roof that she had been putting off because it required someone on the roof while someone else handled materials, and she hadn't had a second someone she was willing to ask. Martin was on the roof and she was on the ground, and the repair took one morning, and she made sure he had proper lunch afterward. They worked well together in all the ways that mattered. They had different strengths. Myrtle's were in the financial and organizational aspects of ranching, the record-keeping and the buying negotiations and the long-range planning. Martin's were in the physical assessment of range and animals, the diagnostic work of looking at land and stock and knowing what they needed. Together they were comprehensive in a way neither had been alone. He moved his few possessions to her ranch, which was now unambiguously their ranch, and gave George Haverston proper notice and helped him find a replacement foreman because he was a man who finished what he started properly. He built himself a place in the Ford ranch operation that was respectful of what she'd built and additive to it, and Myrtle watched him integrate into the work of her life with a competence and care that made her chest feel full in a way she no longer tried to manage away. By September, she knew she was carrying their child. She told him in the kitchen after supper on a Monday evening, having spent 4 days being sure before she said anything, because she was always sure before she said anything. She set down her coffee and looked at him across the table and said, "I'm going to have a child. In the spring, I think." Martin set down his own cup and looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen before on his face, something wide open and not quite managed, something like wonder and like gratitude and like a man who had given up hoping for a particular thing and been given it anyway. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "Tired sometimes, but well." He got up and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair, so he was at her level, and took both her hands in his. "Myrtle," he said, and for a moment he didn't say anything else, and she understood that he was feeling more than he had words for, which was unusual for him, and she found she didn't mind waiting. "I'm glad," he said finally. "I am so glad." She looked at him, this man who had asked instead of offered, who had been patient when patience was what she needed, who had walked into her barn in April of the previous year and changed the calculation of everything. And she felt the particular quality of gladness that comes from a life turning toward something rather than away from it. "So am I," she said. "Very glad." He stayed crouched beside her chair for a while longer, holding her hands, and outside the kitchen window the Oklahoma Territory evening was doing its extravagant business with color and light, and the cattle were moving through the near pasture in the golden hour the way cattle do when they are settled and the grass is good and the water is plentiful. And it was a good life, a real life, made of work and choice and the quiet extraordinary fact of not being alone in it anymore. The winter of 1886 was mild enough to be manageable and hard enough to be honest, and Myrtle worked through the early months of her pregnancy with her usual stubbornness, which Martin respected while also insisting, with a firmness that matched her own, that she not climb things she didn't need to climb, and that she eat properly, and that she tell him when something was too heavy to carry alone. She told him when something was too heavy. That was a development she noted privately, that she could say it now, "I need help with this." And it did not feel like defeat or obligation or the beginning of a debt that would be used against her. It felt like what it was, the ordinary practical admission between two people who were building something together that some things required two people. Billy Reeves, who was 23 and had been with her 3 years now, took on additional supervisory responsibility for the herd through the winter months, and Myrtle paid him the raise he deserved for it and told him plainly that he'd earned it. And he turned red about the ears and said he'd do right by her, and she knew he meant it. Martin handled the heavy fence work and the supply runs and the things that required sustained physical effort in cold weather. And he also, quietly and without being asked, took over the evening check of the stock in December and January, so that Myrtle didn't have to go out into the cold at 8 o'clock every night. She noticed and said nothing for 2 weeks and then said thank you, and he said it was nothing and she said it wasn't nothing, and he looked at her in that steady way and said, "No, you're right, it's not nothing. You're welcome." The baby was born on a Thursday morning in the first week of April 1887, exactly 2 years after Martin had ridden into Pawnee County on a dark bay horse with a canvas saddlebag and a letter for George Haverston. Myrtle had sent for the midwife, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, who had delivered half the children in the county and who came to the Ford ranch with her bag and her knowledge and her calm efficiency. And Martin stayed on the other side of the door in the kitchen, because that was where he was supposed to be, and paced, and drank the coffee he made at midnight, and the coffee he made at 4 in the morning, and the coffee he made at 6. And listened to the sounds from the bedroom, with an attention that was focused and powerless, in the way that waiting for something you cannot effect is always both. He heard the child cry at 7:30, and he sat down hard in the kitchen chair and put his face in his hands, not from grief, but from the overwhelming release of every hour of worry that had been accumulating for the past 9 months and particularly the past 9 hours. Mrs. Alvarez opened the door and said, "Mr. Walden, you have a boy." He went in. Myrtle was sitting up in the bed, tired in a way that had no other word for it, and she was holding the boy, who was red-faced and alive, and making the particular sounds of a person who has just arrived and has opinions about it. She looked up when Martin came in, and her face was the face of a woman who has just done something very hard and is both exhausted and triumphant, which was the face he associated with her most, he realized, because it was the face she wore after anything that mattered. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at their son. "He's perfect," Martin said. "He is," she agreed, and very loud. "Good," he said. "Good lungs." She laughed, which was also tired but real, and he put his arm around her carefully, and she leaned against him with the ease of a woman who had stopped needing to hold herself perfectly upright every moment, and they both looked at the boy in her arms. "I want to call him James," Myrtle said. "James Thomas Walden, Thomas for his grandfather." Martin was quiet for a moment. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right." James Thomas Walden was a loud and healthy and opinionated child from his first hour on earth, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He grew through the spring and summer of 1887 in the particular dramatic way of first children, making each small development feel enormous. And Myrtle discovered that she was the kind of mother she had always suspected. She would be devoted, but not hovering, practical but not cold, firmly of the opinion that a child needed to be allowed to attempt things and learn from the attempt. Martin was the kind of father she had not been entirely sure about until she saw him with James in his arms on the second day, telling the baby about cattle with the same patient, serious attention he gave everything. And she had thought then that this was going to be all right, that this specific arrangement of people was going to work, and it was a thought that carried its own particular warmth. The ranch grew through 1887 and 1888 in the practical sense of improved acreage use and better equipment, and a new relationship with a buyer from Kansas City, who was more reliable than Calvert and paid fair on the first offer. Myrtle handled the financial management and the sale negotiations and the record-keeping with the same precision she had always applied to them, and Martin handled the range assessment and the herd management and the hiring decisions with the same practical competence he'd brought from 12 years of experience. And together, they ran one of the tighter operations in Pawnee County. The county was changing around them, too, in the way the Oklahoma Territory was changing through the late 1880s, more settlers coming, more legal structure, more organized township government replacing the informal arrangements that had characterized the earlier years. The Dawes Act of 1887 had brought significant disruptions to the Cherokee and other tribal nations in the territory, reallocating lands in ways that Myrtle found deeply uncomfortable, because she had lived long enough near people who had been on this land before any of the settlers to understand what was being taken and from whom. She said so plainly when the subject came up in county meetings, which it did with the defensiveness of people who didn't want to look at it directly. Martin said so beside her, equally plainly, and they were not the most popular people in the room when they did, but they were honest, which they had decided mattered more. In the spring of 1889, the Oklahoma Land Run opened the unassigned lands to settlement, and the territory became something busier and more contested than it had been, and Myrtle's fence line needed checking more than once in the months that followed as new settlers tried to understand their boundaries, and some of them got it wrong in directions that benefited themselves. She and Martin handled each instance with the same precision: property records, county officials, clear communication, and prevailed each time because her documentation was impeccable. James was 2 in April of 1889, talking in the determined way of a 2-year-old who has strong opinions and insufficient vocabulary. And Martin had taken to carrying him on the dark bay for short rides around the near pasture, which James found thrilling, and which Myrtle watched from the fence with an expression she would have described as attentive, and which Martin described, privately and with great affection, as besotted. She told him she was expecting again that summer July in the same kitchen over the same kind of coffee, and this time she told him more quickly. She had not needed 4 days to be sure, she had known within a week, and this time Martin did not crouch beside her chair, because he had learned by now that she did not always require that kind of response. He reached across the table and took her hand and said, "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said, "better than last time in the early months." "Good," he said. He squeezed her hand and then held it. "Good." The second child was born in February of 1890 in the same bedroom with the same Mrs. Alvarez, and was a girl, small and dark-haired and possessed of the same loud opinions as her brother. Myrtle named her Clara, which she had decided on during the pregnancy, and told Martin when she was certain. He was quiet for a long moment when she said it. Clara had been his first wife's name. She had thought about that, had turned it over carefully for weeks, and had concluded that it was a name she wanted to offer, not as a replacement for anything but as an acknowledgement that all the lives and losses that had brought them to this kitchen, and this ranch and this family were part of the same continuing story and deserved to be honored. "Clara Myrtle Walden," she said. He looked at her for a long time in the lamplight of the bedroom, with the baby in the bassinet beside the bed and James asleep in his room down the hall, and his eyes were bright in the particular way of a man who is feeling something too large for the space of a room. "Thank you," he said. "She'll be her own person," Myrtle said. "She already is. You can see it." "I can see it," he agreed and smiled. Clara Myrtle Walden was from her first weeks a person of considerable character and considerable determination, which she combined with an ability to charm that James had never quite mastered, and which Martin said with great affection was entirely her mother's. Myrtle disputed this, pointing out that Martin could be considerably charming himself when he chose to deploy it, and Martin said he'd learned from watching her, and she said that was an outright fabrication, and they were arguing about it cheerfully in the kitchen while Clara watched from her basket with the interested attention of a person who was filing information. The ranch in 1890 was a different thing from the ranch of 1881, and also the same thing. The same 700 acres of red Oklahoma earth and open sky. The same herd, grown now to over 400 head. The same house, with a room added on the east side that Martin had built the previous summer, with Billy and Court helping and James handing over nails with the gravity of a person performing important work. The same well, and the second well, and the 2 barns, and the fence post she had driven herself into the hard ground, and all the daily accumulated evidence of a life built by choice and maintained by work. Different in the mornings now, when the kitchen had 2 adults in it and 2 children growing through the particular stages of growing, and different in the evenings when the porch held 2 chairs side by side, and the sunsets were shared rather than witnessed alone, and different in the nights when the house was warm and full of the sounds of sleeping people, and there was nothing to manage except the ordinary peace of it. One evening in the fall of 1890, with James nearly 4 and Clara 8 months old, and the cattle settled for the winter and the accounts in good order, Myrtle sat on the porch beside Martin in the blue evening air and looked out over her land, their land, and thought about the woman who had stood in a churchyard in 1881 and made a promise to herself in the red Oklahoma dirt. She had kept that promise. She had not asked. She had built what she had alone, by her own hands and her own mind, and her own stubborn refusal to let anyone define the terms of her survival but herself. She had kept that promise for 4 years, and it had been the right promise for those years, and she had nothing to regret about it. And then someone had come along who hadn't waited to be asked, who had asked her instead, asked her small things, honest things, whether she'd be opposed to a neighbor, whether she'd let him court her, whether she'd marry him, what she needed when her hands were already full. And the asking had been different from every other asking she had known because it had always given her the real and genuine choice of no. She had said yes each time with full knowledge of what yes meant, and every yes had been right, and the sum of them was this: a porch in the Oklahoma fall with a man beside her who had never once made her wish she hadn't said it. "You're thinking," Martin said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "What about tonight?" She looked at him. The evening light was low and golden, and it made him look, as it often did, like something worth looking at. The lines of his face that had deepened over the 5 years she'd known him, the gray that had come into his dark hair at the temples, the hands resting on the arm of the chair that were the most capable and the most gentle hands she had ever known. "About all of it," she said, "everything that's happened." "Good or bad," he said. "Overwhelmingly good," she said. "The hard parts made the good parts make sense." He nodded. He looked out at the land. "I think that's the truth of most things." "It is," she agreed. The sky was going from gold to rose to the deep blue that preceded the stars, and somewhere in the house Clara made a small sound that was not quite distress and not quite content, the sound of a baby settling, and then was quiet again. James would be sleeping already, because he was the kind of child who slept hard when he slept, making up for all the energy expended in the waking hours. "I want to say something," Martin said. "Say it," she said. He turned to look at her and she looked back. "I know you built this yourself," he said. "Everything you have here. I know you did it without help and by choice, and that you were right to do it that way, and that you didn't need anyone to come along and change any of it." "But," she said. "But I am glad I came along," he said. "Not because you needed me, because of what it's been, what it is." He paused. "I had stopped thinking I would have this kind of life again. I'd made peace with that. And then you were there. And you were exactly who you are, and I am grateful for every day of it." Myrtle looked at him in the deepening blue evening and felt the full weight of what he'd said and the full simple truth of her own response to it, which was not complicated and had not been complicated since at least December of 1885, when she'd said yes on the cold night road. "I'm grateful too," she said. "For all of it. For you." She reached across the space between the chairs, which was a small space by now, and he took her hand and held it, and they sat together on the porch of the ranch she had built and he had joined, and they had made into something more than either of them alone, as the Oklahoma sky went fully dark above them, and the stars came out one by one, abundant and indifferent and beautiful in the way of things that are always there whether you have someone to watch them with or not, but are considerably better when you do. Inside the house, Clara made another small sound and then settled. Outside, a horse moved in the near pasture. The grass whispered in the night wind. The stars multiplied. And Myrtle Ford Walden, the woman who had driven her own fence posts and mended her own fences and raised her own cattle and asked nothing from any man for 4 years, sat on her porch with her hand in her husband's hand and her children sleeping in the warm house behind her and her land stretching out in every direction in the dark. And she felt, thoroughly and completely and without reservation, that she had everything she needed. Not because someone had come along and given it to her. Because she had built it, year by year and choice by choice. And because the man beside her had understood from the very first that it was hers, and had asked to be part of it rather than asking her to make it smaller, and because she had said yes from a place of fullness rather than need, and that had made all the difference. Spring came again the following year, and with it the calving, and with the calving the inevitable long nights and difficult mornings, and the complicated particular satisfaction of new life arriving in the straw. James was old enough now to come to the barn with his father in the early mornings, bundled in his small coat, serious-faced and attentive, asking questions in the way of a 4-year-old who wants to understand everything immediately. Martin answered each question with the same patience he applied to everything, and Myrtle watched the two of them from across the barn, and thought that this too was something she had built, even if it had taken more than one pair of hands, even if the best things sometimes did. The cattle count that spring was 422 head, the strongest it had ever been, and the land was in the best condition it had been since she first took it over in 1881, and the accounts were in good order, and the new section of fencing Martin had put in along the south was solid and straight, and Billy Reeves had told her the previous fall that he was thinking of putting in for his own land claim under the new settlement arrangements. And Myrtle had told him she would give him a good recommendation and a fair severance, and that she was proud of what he'd built for himself, and she had meant every word of it. She hired a young woman named Ada Greer that spring to help in the house, because Clara needed tending through the day when both Myrtle and Martin were working range, and Ada was sensible and reliable, and proved within a month to be entirely capable of managing James's considerable energy, which was a relief to everyone. Life in the territory was settling into its next phase, the slow, organized transformation from frontier to something more structured, and Myrtle watched it with the attention she gave most things, noting what was changing, assessing what it meant for her operation, making adjustments where adjustments were warranted. She was 37 years old in 1891, and she felt it not as a reduction but as an accumulation. The years had added things to her rather than taken them, and what they had added was knowledge and competence and a settled certainty about who she was and what she was building. Martin was 40, and had the look of a man who had made good use of his years, not an old look, but a seasoned one, the look of someone who had been in difficult weather and knew how to read the sky. He had gray at his temples and the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into Oklahoma sun, and he moved through the work of the ranch with the ease of a man who had found the place where his skills and his life matched. And Myrtle thought sometimes that it must be something to see, from the outside, the two of them, working the same land from different angles and meeting in the middle where the work required it. One morning in late May of 1891, Myrtle was checking the south fence line on horseback when she came across a section she'd been watching with concern through the winter. 3 posts had worked loose in the spring ground, which was soft from the good rains, and the wire was sagging in a way that would need addressing before it became a gap. She had the tools in her saddlebag, as she always did, and she could have stopped and handled it herself, as she always had. She dismounted, tied her horse, and took out the tools. And then Martin came around the far end of the fence line because he had been checking the east side and was working his way toward her. And he saw what she was doing and dismounted and came to help without asking, because they had been working together long enough that some things didn't require the asking anymore. And she was glad of it in the particular way. She was glad of things that had earned their way to easy. They fixed the fence together, the two of them working the soft ground and the wire in the warm May morning. And when it was done, they stood back and looked at the line of posts running straight into the distance the way it was supposed to. And Myrtle thought about the first fence post she'd ever driven alone, in the spring of 1881, with her sleeves rolled past her elbows and her jaw set and her grief still raw, and she thought about this fence post now. And the distance between those two moments felt both very long and exactly the right length, exactly as long as it needed to be to bring her here. "Good line," Martin said. "Good work," she said. He looked at her sideways with a half-smile. "4 years ago you wouldn't have let me help with a fence post. 3 years ago," she corrected, "and I let you help in April of '85. You let me hold a cow's head," he said. "That was the beginning," she said. "It was," he agreed. She picked up her tools and put them back in the saddlebag and untied her horse, and he did the same, and they rode back to the ranch in the good May morning with the grass green from the rains and the sky enormous above them and the cattle visible in the far pasture. And it was a fine day and a good life, and she had built every part of it, including this. Clara walked her first steps that June in the kitchen, between Martin's hands and Myrtle's, taking the unsteady, determined steps of a person who has decided that this is happening today, and both of them were there for it, and Myrtle thought that was right. That was how it should be. The important things witnessed by both of them together. James started at the small county school in September and came home every day with information he considered urgent and opinions he had developed in the previous 7 hours, and a hunger that required addressing before the information and opinions could be properly conveyed. He was his mother's son in his precision and his stubbornness and his preference for direct communication, and his father's son in his patience with animals and his ability to be still when stillness was required. And he was entirely himself in the ways that children always are, which are the most interesting ways. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, not without difficulty, because difficulty does not stop for anyone's happiness, but with the particular quality of difficulty that has good company and is therefore bearable. There were hard seasons and hard cattle markets, and one year with a drought that tested everyone in the county. There were fence lines that needed mending and animals that needed doctoring and account books that needed balancing, and the endless daily labor of a working ranch that does not stop, because you are tired or cold, or would like a day that isn't full. Through all of it, Myrtle Ford and Martin Walden worked their land and raised their children and kept their accounts in order, and maintained their fences, and negotiated fair prices with buyers who knew better than to lowball either of them. And they talked every evening about things that mattered and things that didn't. And they argued when arguing was warranted and agreed when agreeing was honest, and sat in companionable silence when silence was what the evening called for. In the spring of 1893, 12 years after Thomas Ford had died, and Myrtle had stood in the Oklahoma dirt and made her promise, she sat on the porch of the ranch that was now entirely hers and Martin's in every sense, with Clara on her lap and James leaning against the porch post watching the evening come down over the pasture, and Martin in the chair beside her with his long legs stretched out and his hat on his knee. And she thought that if she had been told in 1881 what the next 12 years would look like, she might not have believed the good parts. She would have believed the hard parts, the lone winters and the difficult calving seasons and the fence disputes, and the fights with buyers who thought a woman would settle for less. She had known those were coming. What she hadn't known, standing in the red Oklahoma dirt with her grief still fresh and her sleeves ready to roll up, was that 12 years down the road there would be a man in the chair beside her who had asked instead of assumed, who had been patient instead of impatient, who had understood that what she had built was hers and had asked to be part of it rather than part of her, and that she would have said yes when she was ready, because he had waited for her to be ready. "James," she said. Her son turned and looked at her. He was 6 years old and had his father's dark eyes and her auburn in his hair and his own particular expression that was already entirely distinct from both of them. "Yes, Mama. Come here a minute," she said. He came and sat on the porch step at her feet, and she put her free hand on his shoulder, Clara still in her other arm, heavy and warm with approaching sleep, and Martin looked over at her with that steady look that she had been reading for 7 years now and that she still found worth reading, because there was always something in it that was direct and true. "What is it?" Martin said. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He understood her, which was one of the things she had come to count on the way she counted on fence posts and water and good grass, as the constant and reliable infrastructure of her life. He smiled at her in the falling evening light. "Everything," he agreed. The stars were coming out, as they always did, over the Oklahoma territory that was not quite a territory any more. Statehood would come in 1907, and they both knew the territory was changing into something more settled, more organized, less wild in some ways and more itself in others. And the cattle were in the pasture and the children were here, and the ranch was sound, and the years ahead were unknown in their particulars but certain in their shape, which was the shape of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge and no reservation, and who had meant it completely. Myrtle Ford had raised her cattle alone for 4 years and asked nothing from any man. That was true, and it would always be true, and she was proud of every year of it. And then Martin Walden had asked her something, and she had answered. And the answer had been the best answer she had ever given to any question, and she intended to keep on meaning it for every year that followed, which she expected, based on available evidence, would be many. She held her daughter, and her son sat at her feet, and her husband was beside her, and her land was around her in every direction. And the evening came on warm and quiet over the Oklahoma hills, and it was, by every measure she had, enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.